Nammo Phat. Good morning. Thank you for joining me for today's daily practice check-in. Listen, listen, listen. This beautiful sound calls us back to our true home. The second mindfulness training. Aware of the suffering caused by exploitation, social injustice, stealing, and oppression, I vow to cultivate loving kindness and learn ways to work for the well-being of people, animals, plants, and minerals. I will practice generosity by sharing my time, energy, and material resources with those who are in real need. I am determined not to steal and not to possess anything that should belong to others. I will respect the property of others, but I will prevent others from profiting from human suffering or the suffering of other species on earth. This morning we continue with Ajahn Ternicero's book on the karma of questions. Each time you're about to act, ask yourself, this action that I want to do, would it lead to self-harm, to the harm of others, or to both? Is it an unskillful action with painful consequences, painful results? If you foresee harm, don't follow through with it. If not, go ahead and act. While acting, ask yourself if there are any unexpected bad consequences arising. If there are, stop. If there aren't, continue with what you're doing. When the action is done, look into its actual short and long-term consequences. If an action in word or deed has ended up causing harm, inform an experienced fellow practitioner on the path. This is why the Buddha established the Sangha. And listen to that person's advice. If the mistaken action was purely an act of the mind, try to develop distaste for that kind of thinking. In both cases, resolve never to make the same mistake again, and use your ingenuity to make the resolve stick. If, however, the long-term consequences of the original action were harmless, take joy and satisfaction in being on the right path and continue your training. As you stay with this line of questioning, it fosters two major results. To begin with, you become more sensitive to your actions and respectful of their effects, both in the present and over time. Unlike the child who says, "It was already broken when I stepped on it," you're aware of when you break things, physical or mental, and when you don't. At the same time, you gain mastery over the patterns of action and effect. You get better and better at handling things without their getting broken. This in turn fosters a healthy sense of self and I based on competence and skill. Your sense of self becomes good-humored enough to freely admit mistakes, mature enough to learn from them, quick enough to notice the immediate effects of your actions, while patient enough to strive for long-term goals. Confident in its own powers of observation, this I also has the humility needed to learn from the experience and advice of others. These two results, sensitivity to the effects of your own actions and a competent sense of self, enable you to settle into a level of mental concentration that's solid and nourishing. You overcome the hindrance of uncertainty as to what's skillful and unskillful, and you are able to develop the skillful qualities needed to center the mind. As the centered focus develops, an interesting thing happens. Your sensitivity to actions and your sense of self come face to face. You begin to see that self as not as a thing, but as an activity, a process of I-making and my-making in which you repeatedly create and recreate your sense of who you are. You also begin to notice that this I-making, even when it produces the most skillful self possible, inevitably results in stress. Why? because any sense of I or mine involves clinging, even when your concentration tunes into a sense of universal self, and all clinging is stressful. So to take the development of skillfulness to its ultimate degree, you have to unlearn the habit of I-making and my-making, and to do this, another set of questions is required. These are the questions that introduce the strategy of not-self. The Buddha recommends that you focus on any phenomenon around which you might sense an I or a mine, and ask a series of questions starting with, is this constant or inconstant? If you identify with your body, look at it. You'll see that it grows hungry and thirsty, that it's aging, destined to grow ill and die. And is anything inconstant easeful or stressful? Look at any attempt to find a stable happiness based on the body, and you'll see how stressful it is. And is it fitting to regard what's inconstant, stressful, subject to change as, this is mine, this is myself, this is what I am? Pursue this line of inquiry inward, through layer after layer of physical and mental events, until you can zero in on the high command, the self that's managing not only the stability of your concentration, but also your internal dialogue of questions and answers. Fortified with the sense of stability and calm that come with strong concentration, you can start deconstructing that self with no anxiety over what will happen when it's gone. And when the intentions making up that self are deconstructed, a strange thing happens. It's as if you had pulled out a strategic thread holding a tapestry together, and now the whole thing unravels on its own. Everything that could possibly be clung to falls away. What remains is total, absolute freedom, free from time and space, from both self and not self, for both self and not self are perceptions, which that freedom transcends. Even when you've had only a first humbling taste of this freedom, you appreciate how adroitly the teaching on not self answers the question of what is skillful, and you understand why the Buddha recommends putting the question of who am I aside. To begin with, it wouldn't have taken you to this freedom, and could well have stood in freedom's way. Because your I is an activity, any attempt to pin it down before you had mastered the processes of activity would have left you pouncing on shadows, distracted from the real work at hand. Any attempt to deconstruct your I before it had become healthy and mature would have led to a release neurotic and insecure. You'd simply be running away from the messy, mismanaged parts of your life. In addition, any answer to the question, who am I, would be totally inappropriate to describe your newfound freedom, for it's a dimension apart, where the concepts of I, am not, do not apply. The only question still concerning you is how to dig out the remaining roots of unskillfulness still latent in the mind. Once they're dug up, the Buddha promises, nothing stands in the way to fulfill the final freedom, and in that freedom, the mind lacks nothing, has nothing in excess. There's none of the delusion that would shape the whole of a burning question, and none of the greed or aversion that would give it teeth. The only remaining questions are bonus ones. How best to take whatever skills you develop along the way and use them purely for the benefit of the world. And what more could you possibly ask? May all beings be well. May all beings be happy. May all beings be peaceful. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. Thank you for joining me this morning.